And the advantages white people enjoy, the privileges they have, are endless.
This is not about the demonization of any group. This is about the defense against the demonization of one group, white Americans. A super racist BBC documentary. This is why Europeans think Americans are racist.
Mr. Reagan.
So I've just found out that if you subscribe to my channel, it does nothing. If you want to be notified of videos, you have to hit the bell icon next to the subscription button. So yeah, I am a bit late to the game with that. So this video is a recommendation from one of my subscribers. It is amazing how awful some of the stuff out there is. This one is seriously unbelievable. But YouTube doesn't care about fake news being perpetuated by leftists, just anything conservative, no matter how true it is. Now, in Russia, there is a saying, if you avoid doing good things, you'll avoid disastrous retribution. It's very much like the American expression, no good deed goes unpunished. By watching this YouTube video on reason, rationality, and truth, you have done your good deed. Now, you must be punished. I've got to talk about Trump coins. For this Father's Day, Noble Gold have combined their best-selling Freedom 2020 President Trump 1-ounce silver coin and their 10-ounce United We Stand silver bullion bar into an unforgettable twin set. Struck in .999 fine silver, these breathtaking specials will become collector's pieces in years to come. And I actually think that's true because imagine having a Ronald Reagan coin today. How cool would that be? So for Father's Day, Noble Gold is offering this sensational set with a $30 discount when you use the code MrReagan30. Show your dad how special he is and order yours today. Link, as usual, is in the description below. One more thing, I'm going to be speaking in Chicago at the International Conference on Men's Issues this August. The conference is August 16th, 17th, and 18th. Sargon of Akkad will be there, Count Dankula, Paul Elam, Janice Fiamengo, Karen Strawn, and a ton of other awesome people. So if you fancy a trip to Chicago in August, get your tickets now, and I will have that link also in the description. Okay, let's watch this dumpster fire of a documentary.
It seems bizarre to have to ask the question, does America have a race problem? All the evidence says yes.
All the evidence says yes. What evidence? He's showing clips of the civil rights movement that happened 50 years ago. These events are so old that they were documented using black and white film. My parents were children when this happened. He's also showing some clips of the Black Lives Matter protesters and instances of so-called police brutality, things that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. But this movement was based almost entirely on false premises, lies, fake news. All right, but that's a topic for another video. The important thing about this part of the film, the very beginning of the documentary, is that this guy is presenting his own bias completely transparently. He's stating that the evidence of racism in America from white people against black people and, other minorities is true, without question. It's not only true, but it's obvious. Okay, now this is a huge perception problem that the European nations have about the United States. I've encountered this time after time after time. The media in the UK and throughout Europe loves to characterize Americans as fat, stupid, and racist. Europeans tend to see two types of Americans. Americans from Los Angeles and New York, whom they idolize and respect, and the rednecks throughout the rest of the country, whom they think all attend the Hillsborough Baptist Church. I lived in England for a short time, and the people there were often astonished at my level of sophistication. And no, I am not the most sophisticated American. I'm just a guy from Oregon. I grew up riding horses and dirt bikes. And this wasn't like dressage. This is like, my buddy's got a horse on his farm. He wants to go for a ride around the fields, maybe through the forest. None of the people that I grew up with were rich. But despite growing up on the hard streets of Salem, Oregon, I was able to eke out some kind of rudimentary education. I was able to adopt a vocabulary slightly broader than that of Cro-Magnon man. So the Europeans that I met whilst in Britain were astonished to hear that I was not from New York or LA. They found it shocking that I had come from a typical, averaged, ordinary American town. But what was more shocking to them, what was utterly bewildering, what they could never quite reconcile, was that I was a conservative. Not only was I conservative, but I was a Christian conservative Republican. This, to the common man or woman in Britain and throughout Europe, these are all the hallmarks of an American redneck. As far as they're concerned, it's black and white. There are the dumb, fat, racist Republican rednecks, and then there are the erudite, cosmopolitan New Yorkers and Hollywood elites, Robert Downey Jr., Gwyneth Paltrow, Sean Penn, George Clooney, DiCaprio, De Niro. They're the ones that the Europeans and the British all look up to and aim to be like. And this is truthfully why Europe is so crazy leftist. Because of European perceptions of leftist elites in America, Europeans are driven to emulate this kind of insanity. They are also prone to believe whatever the insane left in America says about America. So if all the reporters at the New York Times and all the writers in Hollywood are telling everyone around the world that white Americans are all racist, these European sycophants of the New York and Hollywood elite will simply believe it without question. These ideas have become so ubiquitous that even conservatives in Britain and throughout Europe believe that white Americans are deeply racist. It's insanely frustrating. I actually have an idea about how to teach Europeans about what the race situation is actually like in America, and I will probably do that video at some point. But until then, I hope this video goes some way toward alleviating this problem.
Surveys consistently show that while most black people believe race is an issue, most white people don't. A divergence of opinion that existed even at the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Most white people didn't understand what Martin Luther King was trying to do.
Whoa, 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 whoa. This guy just took a statistic and drew a completely illogical conclusion from it. He made a huge jump in logic. The statistic he stated, or the fact, or whatever you want to call it, was that most Americans during the civil rights movement did not think that race was an issue. Now, I don't know where he got this statistic. I tried looking it up and I couldn't find anything, any study remotely like that. I mean, I'd love to see his source material there, but I simply don't believe it. It completely defies reason and historical fact. Obviously, every white person in America understood that there was some kind of race issue happening in America during the civil rights movement. Now, I'm going to give this guy the benefit of the doubt and assume that what he meant to say was that most white people in America during the civil rights movement didn't believe that white racism specifically was a significant problem throughout most of the country at the time. Now, I'm not even sure that that is correct, but that statistic to me sounds a lot more reasonable. And this could have been actually a natural perception that most Americans would have had in the 1960s. We tend to think of the 1960s in America as an absolutely terrible time for black people. The general belief tends to be, at least amongst people who are around my age and younger, tends to be that the people throughout the country, black people, white people, they had different drinking fountains, that black people were kept from voting through physical intimidation, that the Ku Klux Klan was rampant through the country, and that black people couldn't get a loan or housing anywhere. This is all, of course, ridiculous. There were, of course, racists all over the place, but even in the 1960s, racism was considered a terrible thing by most people. The only places in which blacks were strongly bigoted against were certain places in the South, like Montgomery, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, you'll find tons of instances, anecdotes about racism being perpetuated against people throughout, the country. You'll find that stuff all over the internet. But the truth is, racism against black people throughout most of the country during the civil rights movement was considered terribly wrong by most white people at the time. What this guy in the documentary is doing here is this weird thing that Hollywood likes to do all the time, all right? There's this tendency to make black people in America historically very sophisticated, well-spoken, well-educated, very enlightened, and most white people, on the other hand, dullards, racist, ignorant, uneducated, bullies, if not murderously violent. This guy's characterization of white people versus black people in the 1960s is a perfect example of this kind of revisionist history. Black people understood that there was a race issue in America. White people did not. They didn't understand what Martin Luther King was doing. Not only is this completely false and misleading to the British audience for which it is produced, but is also deeply racist. Could you imagine a white person hosting a documentary like this, driving in their car, turning to camera and saying, in this era, white people were perfectly aware of this serious problem in America, but black people, they just didn't understand it. Even if what they were saying is true, just expressing the idea that maybe white people in America understood something better than black people in America, that would be perceived by many people as pure racism. This guy is saying something equivalent to this, but it's completely false, first of all, and yet he has no fear of retribution. I doubt that he would ever even imagine that he might be fired because of saying something like this. He's saying white people are ignorant, black people are savvy, and that's okay. Even if the information is false, it's not racist because he's elevating black people, and he's falsely condemning white people, but it doesn't matter. That's okay with the left because, whatever. White people are bad, black people are good. It's funny how he doesn't even think about that, but of course I would have to think about that if I was making a documentary. So maybe we should call this differentiation in reality, the fact that he doesn't even have to think about that problem. Maybe we should call that, I don't know, black privilege?
I'm going on a journey into the mind of white America.
He's going on a journey into the mind of white America. Okay, now I haven't watched this, so this is purely speculation on my part, but my guess is that this guy is absolutely not going to accurately uncover what's going on in the mind of white America, okay? If this guy were going to be doing a truthful documentary, the conclusion he would come to is that the reason why white Americans don't perceive themselves as racist is because white Americans are not racist. I imagine that, okay, first of all, I doubt that he even interviewed any intelligent, politically minded right-wing Americans, black or white. But if he did, I imagine that if anything reasonable was said to him, recorded by his cameras, anything that might have convincingly contradicted his established bias that white Americans are racist, anything like that, would not actually make it into the final cut of the film. It would have been cut out, left on the cutting room floor, as we say in Hollywood. Now, again, this is pure speculation. I could be wrong. Let's find out.
It could be a bumpy ride, according to Talk Radio.
The value in black life, given the illegitimacy rate, out-of-wedlock rate, is far higher than that of the rest of the society. The reason that people have children before they marry is values, not poverty.
Blacks are stupid. That is correct.
What the F? Now that was the voice of Dennis Prager. I have listened to several videos by Dennis Prager, interviews on various shows. Dennis Prager is not a racist. Okay, to take the comment "blacks are stupid" out of whatever context within which Dennis Prager originally expressed it is not only deceptive, but it is defamatory. Now, I don't know what the context of that statement originally was. It might have been something to do with the way black Americans vote. It might have been something about the way leftists in America perceive conservatives. I don't know. But Dennis Prager certainly is not a racist. And using his words out of context, as was done in this video, not only makes him look like a racist, but is presented clearly for that purpose. This documentarian has intentionally edited a recording of Dennis Prager to make him appear to be a racist. Now, I suspect that no one on the production team of this documentary knows who Dennis Prager is, right? They're British. It's likely that they found some recording on race by somebody that they thought was a generic right-wing American, and since they had no idea who it was, and since they couldn't recognize the voice, they imagined that, well, nobody can recognize that voice. But they're British. Most Americans probably sound the same to them. They're leftists, right? They are unfamiliar with the various conservative voices in America. But any conservative American who has ever listened to Dennis Prager will recognize that voice. Now, it would take some digging, but I'm sure I could find the original context of that statement and prove in court that these filmmakers intentionally mischaracterized Dennis Prager as a racist. I'm not going to do that because I think it would be far easier for Dennis Prager himself to do it, and I hope that he does do it. But honestly, this film is pissing me off more and more with each second. It is pure racist propaganda up until this point.
I didn't want to talk to any African Americans for this film. Discrimination is obviously a black issue, but when you think about it, it's mainly a white problem.
Racial discrimination is a black issue and a white problem. Again, this guy reveals his extraordinary bias clearly and unequivocally. He says he doesn't want to speak to any black people. I would have loved it if he'd spoken to Thomas Sowell or Larry Elder or to Ben Carson or to Candace Owens or Jesse Lee Peterson. But you know what? Okay, if you really wanted to strictly abide by this ridiculous idea of not speaking to black Americans, he should have come and spoken to me.
Bam, 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 bam. And you know it's coming from those areas. And then the next day the news will come on, and sure enough, there was a shooting of some young black man.
I'm part of the problem. Because I don't know how to solve the problem, and so what do? I ignore it.
After a while, the race card has been played so much that it has lost its value.
If you think racism doesn't exist, you're white.
Okay, so they get this one woman to talk about how she sees, or hears rather, black violence coming from the black neighborhood near where she lives. And then we get some white people saying something vague about racial issues. And, you know, these statements could be interpreted any way you want because there's no context. So then the documentarian ends the 4 clips with a woman saying, if you think racism doesn't exist, you're white. And I think they edited this in just exactly in this way in order to make that last clip seem very powerful, like a punch in the face, right? It's a white person stating that white people are racist. Now, if you spend any time listening to the news or reading about racism in America, hearing a white person say that white people are racist, that's not new. White people have been saying that since the moment white Europeans first met black Africans. Sometimes this accusation is accurate. Other times, it's inaccurate. Today, in America, it tends to be a popular form of virtue signaling. That said, there is no one in America who thinks that racism does not exist. Everybody thinks that racism exists. But some people think that white racism exists as a serious problem in America, and some people think that white racism is relegated to an extreme minority who have no significant effect on just about anybody else in the country. And still other people think that there is a significant amount of racism in America, but it's not coming from white people leveled against black people. Rather, it comes from black people, Hispanics, and Asians against white people. And still there are other people who believe that you cannot be racist if you are black, right? It's not possible.
Yeah, black people can't be racist.
So the issue of what do people believe is nuanced, is multifaceted. The issue is not so simple as, is there racism in America or not? Literally nobody thinks that there are 0 racists in America of any kind whatsoever.
Welcome to white, affluent Milwaukee, home to some of the most expensive real estate in America, all groomed lawns and tended yards. But just a few minutes' drive away are pockets of despair. This is Black Milwaukee, home to 70% of African Americans living in the state of Wisconsin. It's poor, run down, undesirable.
I don't think that I can roll my eyes in a fashion exaggerated enough to express how ridiculous I think this characterization of America is. Okay, look, you can find tons of places in America where there are rich neighborhoods next to poor, predominantly white neighborhoods. Black people do not have a monopoly on poverty in America. And yes, there are rich people in America. Some of those people are white, some of those people are black, some of those people are Jewish, some of those people are Muslim, some of those people are Asian, some of those people are Hispanic. We could go to Hollywood and I could show you tons of homeless white people sleeping on the street. We could then look right across the street and see the restaurant owned by Eva Longoria. This is a very wealthy Latina woman, but she's living near poor white people. Doesn't this prove that Hispanics in America are oppressing poor white people? Of course not. This is ridiculous. And this very specific situation is presented by this documentarian in this very specific way for a reason, obviously. There are many problems that come along with poverty, aside from the direct anguish it causes impoverished people. We all sympathize with impoverished people, right? We all want them to do better, but to juxtapose a poor black neighborhood with a wealthy white neighborhood merely serves to perpetuate the myth that black poverty in America is a consequence of white racism, or conversely, that white wealth is the result of the oppression of black people, which is an even more nefarious myth.
Professor Mark Levine from the University of Wisconsin gave me a tour and explained how over several decades, mortgage lenders and estate agents steered different races to different parts of the city.
You know, they could sort of deny outright racism by simply saying, well, this is just a hard-boiled economic analysis. We know that African Americans are a greater credit risk and they're not going to, pay back these loans, and so we're not going to make those loans. A study was done about a decade ago by the city to look at exactly that issue, and they found that a white household with income around $25,000 a year had about the same rejection rate for housing loans as a black family with income over $125,000 a year.
Now, I've heard this lending issue brought up many, many times, but I've never seen anyone exhibit any evidence that the home loan lenders were racist. The conclusion that everyone seems to jump to is that if the banks are refusing to lend money to black people who have the same income as white people to whom they are lending money, well, then those bank loan officers must be racist. However, this is only true if all the other factors are equal. There are a lot of requirements to getting a bank loan. I was talking to my father about this because when I was young, my father used to sometimes take out loans for the business that he had started. And I asked him how easy it was for him to get a loan as a white man because I had heard a related accusation that it was historically more difficult for black people to get business loans than white people. And my dad said that for him, it was ridiculously difficult to get a loan. He had to put up just about everything he owned as collateral. His credit history had to be immaculate. He also was required to draw up a business plan. Now, my father had no idea what a business plan even was. Even just remembering this experience, he got angry because he said, when you're talking about a small business loan for a small business, it's usually for a very basic fundamental thing that can be written in 1 or 2 sentences. To draw up a sophisticated business plan is absurd. Once your business grows big enough, a business plan might be necessary. And it may be that black people who are applying for business loans in America might on average have worse credit scores, or they might not have the collateral necessary to get the loan, the specific loan that they're requesting, or they might not have a good business plan. There is a myriad of reasons why black people in a particular region might have a harder time getting a personal loan or a business loan than a white person in the same area. Now, I would actually like to annotate this idea just a little bit. I would like to say that I am actually open to the possibility that there was some genuine racism at play in the particular case that this college professor is describing. I don't know anything about that particular case. In fact, it's possible that the entire disparity between the allocation of loans to white people versus black people was purely because of white racism against black people in this case. But I find this extraordinarily hard to believe. This guy didn't say when these things happened. If this was like 100 years ago, okay, maybe it was total racism. But in that case, it was 100 years ago. I mean, that's not really relevant to a discussion about whether or not white racism is a significant problem in America today. In fact, unless this was like last week or maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the entire thing is irrelevant. I suspect, and I was born in 1979, I suspect that this did not occur within my lifetime. But too often, I think we tend to assign a racist motivation to a rational phenomenon. In order to truly show that this loan situation was motivated by racism and applicable to a contemporary discussion about white racism in America, you have to show me individual incidents with that clearly illustrate examples of true racism by the bank loan officers. Honestly, showing these kinds of incidents that happened 50, 60, 70 years ago and not exploring all the influences on the bank's decision, this merely serves to perpetuate the story that this guy wants to tell. It doesn't truthfully show anything. It doesn't show what was actually happening historically, and it's utterly irrelevant to the attitudes of white Americans today.
And the result of racism in mortgage lending is segregation. And that in turn fuels poverty, poor schools, and so on. As investors turn their backs on black areas, neighborhoods are left to rot.
Segregation causes poverty and neighborhoods are left to rot. Well, not in some predominantly Asian neighborhoods, not in some predominantly white neighborhoods, not in some predominantly Jewish neighborhoods. And look, you might not believe this, but that's not true in every predominantly black neighborhood. Most people generally tend to self-segregate. Now, this is not necessarily self-segregation based on race. I mean, look at like public school, right? Sometimes the kids hang out with each other based on race. Sometimes it's because of like 80s style cliques, right? You might find an Asian kid and a Jewish kid and a black kid and a white kid all friends because they're math nerds or science nerds, or they might love hip hop or breakdancing, or they might be in the choir or the orchestra or the acting club. Just think about the high school football team. There's white guys, there's black guys, they're buddies. Nobody thinks about race. They hang out because they're athletes. And sometimes we're attracted to people who are exotic. I, for instance, am a bit biased toward foreigners because I find the exotic more interesting than the familiar. But that's not typical. Most people find the familiar more attractive. And that makes sense. I mean, consider what our ancestors had to deal with. If our ancient ancestors, right, they lived in a village, and they go outside the village, they meet some stranger outside the village, and that stranger was hostile, our ancestor would be dead if he was not afraid or cautious around that foreigner. And so the people who are maybe a bit cautious or maybe afraid or maybe even violent against strangers, those are the ones that lived. Those were our ancestors. So over the centuries, our ancestors grew to be more and more tribal, right? We became people who were more attracted to our own kind than to strangers. And even within our own lifetimes, this happens because we become very familiarized when we're very young with our parents, and hopefully our parents are, care for us and protect us and stuff like that. And so we grow up thinking these are safe people. We naturally feel safer around people who kind of look something like them. Now, this kind of familiarity bias might morph into some kind of racism, but in white American culture, we are taught that this is a bad thing. So this tendency does not typically turn into racism within white culture today. It can sometimes, but this is really quite rare. However, most other races in America are not taught so strictly to think of racism as evil. At worst, I think many black people are taught that white people are bad. And at best, I just think that black people are simply not taught not to hate white people. And the same goes for Hispanics and Asians and immigrants from all over the world. I once met this Sikh guy in Los Angeles, and I asked him if Americans tend to mistake him for Muslim, and he said, yeah, all the time. And I asked him if Sikhs wear like turbans, right? But they're not Muslims. We in America, sometimes we mistake these two groups. And I asked him if he was ever verbally attacked, and if anybody ever called him names or told him to go back to his home country and that kind of stuff. And I was saddened to hear that he had heard these things, and in his words, he heard them all the time. And I was kind of confused by this because in my experience, white Americans just don't seem to be that way. The epidemic of white racism always seemed to me to be a fabrication of CNN. But then the man added something interesting. He said, I never hear this from white people, though. I only hear this from Mexicans and black people. And I was relieved. It still wasn't nice to hear, but at least I felt a little bit vindicated, right? So I think this is a good indication, right, of the cultural differences between white America and other cultures that grow up in America. They don't necessarily have the same restrictions on being racist. And I think that we need to teach everybody, not just white kids, we need to teach everybody not to be racist. But anyway, regardless of the cause, we do tend to find ourselves segregated most of the time into various racial communities in America. But as I said earlier, this does not mean that any particular segregated group should find themselves in poverty or wealthy simply because they are black or white or Asian or Jewish or Hispanic or whatever. The guy who has created this documentary has created a cause and effect that are not logical. He has proposed the idea that segregation causes poverty. But almost every community in America is segregated to some degree. Some of these communities are impoverished, and some of these communities are middle class, and some of these communities are wealthy. There is no absolute correlation between race and income between these communities. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Black people do not have a monopoly on poverty. There are many white communities in America that exist in abject poverty. You cannot claim that because Will Smith is wealthy and the white guy down the hill is middle class, that Will Smith somehow caused the neighbor to be poorer than he is. I would speculate that a lot of the problem in America with black poverty has to do with black culture. I know many people will claim that this is like a racist attitude, but I do not consider any race to be generally superior or inferior than any other race. I certainly do not consider all white people to be better than the people of any other ethnic group. In fact, my best friend is only half white, so maybe that makes me half racist. But seriously, though, I have met enough a-hole white guys to know that not all white people are decent human beings. And I've met enough awesome black people, men and women, young and old, enough Hispanics, enough Asians, enough Muslims, enough Jews, to know that there are amazing people in every race, and there are also douchebags in every race. This is not about the demonization of any group. This is about the defense against the demonization of one group, white Americans. When an entire community blames another entire community for its failings, the community teaches the individuals within that community to ignore their own weaknesses. No one in the community will attend to their own failings they don't improve themselves because nothing is their fault. It's all the fault of the other tribe, right? And each individual, convinced of this idea, reinforces this blame mentality in each other. The truth is that the failings of every black community in America cannot be laid at the feet of white racism. And to claim this instills in the minds of young black people that they will never succeed because of white racism. It deceptively discourages young black people from aiming for the stars. No black boy or black girl should ever be discouraged from striving for success in America because they believe that white Americans will not accept them. Imagine that every black boy and every black girl, instead of being taught that they won't ever amount to anything because white people are racist, imagine if instead of telling them that, we told them that they can achieve anything they want to in America. Imagine if we told each and every one of those little boys and little girls that white people will embrace them, that white people will welcome them into their companies, into their churches, into their personal lives. What if we told them that they could do anything they wanted to do because racism is no longer a serious problem in America? Just imagine that.
Meanwhile, in white Milwaukee,
People who don't even live in the neighborhood tend to walk through here because it's pleasant on the eyes and it's a comfortable place to be. It's safe. But on the other hand, just up a couple of blocks, I can, especially through the summer, hear gunshots, bam, 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 bam.
So if I was to ask you then, what is your view of those African Americans living in that area? What would that be based on? Because it's not on personal contact,
right.
is it?
Honestly, most of it is based on what I see on the news, which unfortunately is a lot of negative.
What I'm saying is I'm part of the problem. Because I don't know how to solve the problem, and so what do? I ignore it.
Do you think a lot of people do that?
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly it's much easier to not know people. If you don't know people, you don't have to accommodate people.
So they just featured 3 white people, middle class, from safe neighborhoods, who all seem to recognize that there is a problem with crime and poverty in the black neighborhood nearby. They all seem saddened by this problem, and the guy even seemed to feel the weight of some kind of guilt for not being able to solve the problem himself. That's a massive amount of responsibility to put on your own shoulders individually. These all seem to be decent people. None of them appear to be remotely racist. Furthermore, they probably have never met a racist in their lives. And although CNN keeps telling them that the reason black people have poverty and crime is because of white people, they probably don't actually see this effect in their day-to-day lives. What the first woman seemed to say is that there does seem to be a lot of violence in the black community. She seemed to suggest that this was a failing of the news media. But if these black guys in these poor black communities are actually shooting and killing each other, and that gets on the news, that's not a failing of the news media. That's simply accurate reporting. And I suppose the alternative would just be to ignore it. But that would be kind of a deceit by omission, something that I think Hollywood and CNN are both deeply guilty of.
These Americans enjoy a privilege. They can avoid the unpalatable. They live comfortable lives in nice areas because they're white.
That was a hell of a jump in logic, again. This guy just takes anything and then he just throws a racial cause behind it. It is astonishing to me that this guy speaks so confidently about these things as if he's educating his public. And I guess, in a way, he is educating the public, but he's educating the public with total nonsense. Let me be very clear about this. The white people living in the safe white neighborhoods with their pretty stores and their financial stability, they don't enjoy privilege because they're white. They enjoy privilege because they're rich. Everything that has been described here is a consequence of wealth privilege. It has nothing to do with being white or being black. Now, we could debate the issues of wealth disparity in America, and that would be an interesting and engaging conversation to have. But more importantly, it would be the appropriate conversation to have. To say that people live in a neighborhood that is safe and happy and perfect and amazing merely because they're white is absurd. It's like this guy is unaware of the existence of wealthy black Americans. Hilariously, he is hosting a documentary that was produced by and is being distributed by the BBC. Clearly, he is a well-off person. He can afford to live in a low-crime neighborhood, and I'm willing to bet that he does. The same thing is going to be true for almost every well-to-do black American. They're probably going to move into a neighborhood with low crime, and the reason that they're going to enjoy this privilege is not because they're white, because they're not white, they're black, but rather they're going to enjoy this privilege because they are wealthy. Wealth privilege.
And the advantages white people enjoy, the privileges they have, are endless.
I can't even. This guy is so absurdly racist, it's almost incomprehensible. I mean, I believe it. I don't like the fact that I believe it. The fact that I unquestioningly believe that this is a serious documentary concerns me deeply. My assumption should really be that this is satire. But sadly, no. I know people genuinely believe this crap.
Academics and educators now believe it's the lack of awareness within the white community of these inbuilt advantages that taints white attitudes to race.
Okay, so here we have the thesis statement of this guy's sophomore essay on race. White people are unaware of their privilege, and this blinds them to the obvious mountain of white racism in America. He quotes professors and academics. He doesn't say which professors. He doesn't say which academics. Well, you know what? I conferred with a bunch of scientists, and they all agreed that BBC documentarians are all imbeciles. And that was the scientific consensus. Researchers, professors, scientists, and other smart people all agree that BBC documentarians are imbeciles. So, you should believe that. It's real facts and information. Okay, so this guy has established that some black communities in America are poor, and he has established that some white communities are rich, and he has jumped to the conclusion that this is exclusively a product of race. He has then explained that because white people are unaware that everything that they have that's good in life is because they're white, and everything that's bad in the life of black people in America is because they're black, he then proposes that because white people don't recognize this, that somehow makes them racist. Okay, or maybe every good thing that happens to white people is not just because they're white, and every bad thing that happens to black people is not just because they're black. Maybe.
So white privilege is growing up in a society not understanding that not everyone has benefits that are unearned as a result of being in white skin.
Have you ever noticed that when people say things that don't make any sense, they often use a lot of words to express this nonsensical idea? Now, when I make my videos, I like to express myself clearly and precisely. I often remove big words that I have inadvertently included in my scripts. And if I don't remove the big word, I will define it for the audience. I do these things because I want to be as clear to my audience as possible. Now, clarity, when communicating, can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, clarity will allow a broad spectrum of people to understand my ideas. On the other hand, it makes my ideas very vulnerable to criticism. But let me tell you a secret. I want my ideas to be vulnerable to criticism because I'm not always right. I know I'm not always right. I want other people to find the flaws in my thinking, point them out to me, and then I can adjust my ideas so that my ideas align better with truth and reason and logic and statistics and evidence and reality. If somebody is using convoluted language in order to express an idea, it's usually a pretty strong indication that they're afraid of criticism. And often, people are afraid of criticism when they are afraid that their ideas might not hold up to scrutiny. This is very obviously the case with this woman. White privilege is growing up in a society not understanding that not everyone has benefits that are unearned as a result of being in white skin. So what she's saying here is that white privilege is the inability to understand that life is awesome when you're white. It's way more awesome than if you're black or Mexican or Japanese or anything else. And it's only awesome because you are white. Being white is awesome. Now, I don't actually think that she intended to use the word understand. Usually when I hear the term white privilege used, it's defined as an imperception of unearned benefits. So it's not that people can't understand that they have unearned benefits because of their race. It's that they don't even perceive that other people don't have the same benefits as they do because of the race. But every benefit that I've ever heard anyone express with regard to white privilege, every benefit is almost always better defined as wealth privilege, regional privilege, athletic privilege, or other privileges totally unrelated to race. These leftist academics are so dang arrogant. They say that people don't recognize their white privilege because they don't know white privilege is a thing. But what these professors and stuff they don't get is that many people are aware of the ridiculous white privilege theory. We simply disagree with you. We just don't buy it. So it would be impossible to say that I benefit from white privilege as defined by this woman or some other academic who is defining it as a lack of understanding or an inability to perceive privilege that I have that is exclusively the result of my race, because I've heard their theory. I recognize that I enjoy benefits that other people do not, but I simply reject the proposition that the benefits I have enjoyed in my life have been a result of my being white. And this is plainly obvious because I've met many white people who have not enjoyed all of the same benefits that I've enjoyed in my life. And I've met many black people who have enjoyed benefits that I have not enjoyed. And I would say that there was a kind of white privilege up until about, the 1960s. And after that, things started to even out. And I would say since about the early 1980s, things have been adequately fair. And at this point, in 2019, they are absolutely fair. In fact, my position is that our society has shifted so much that we sometimes make things somewhat unfair for white people, unfair for men, unfair for Christians. So yeah, white privilege is actually a disingenuous reassigning of various other privileges and attributing those various privileges to race. And this is, of course, absurd. No one is benefiting because they're white or suffering because they're black in America today. People benefit because they're rich. They benefit because they're American, because they're kind, because they're charming, because they're good looking, because they're athletic. You know, people benefit because they're tough and because they're smart. And people suffer for an infinite number of reasons. And you can assign all of those reasons to race. You can say all of that stuff is actually attributable to race, both good things and bad things. But that's all BS. It's all fake. It's all a way of saying that this group deserves and that this group should pay. And it's absurd, convoluted logic, and they express it in an absurd, convoluted way in order to guard this ridiculous idea from any degree of scrutiny.
It may mean that because my name is Martha Berry, people are going to see that as a white name and say, let's get her an interview.
She is demeaning the accomplishments of every individual white person when she says that they are simply beneficiaries of this white privilege. And anyways, lots of black people have white names. The only time that black people have names that are easily distinguished as black is when they name their kids something either African or very weirdly spelled. Oftentimes when somebody expresses a prejudice against somebody named, say, like LaQuisha, it's the same kind of prejudice that's expressed against guys named Randy. That would be class prejudice. That's not racism. And indeed, there is class privilege in America. Okay, that is, if you have a name that sounds very wealthy and impressive, people will probably act favorable toward you. If you have a name that sounds like it comes from the hood or the trailer park, people are probably going to be a little bit more cautious around you. They might not treat you so favorably. And I am sorry to everyone out there named Randy or LaQuisha. I'm not excusing class bias. I'm just explaining it. I don't necessarily think that this is a good thing. I just think that it is a thing. And just like wealth bias, looks bias, height bias, fitness bias, intelligence bias, and all other kinds of bias, it must be distinguished from racism. So many people will see any kind of bias and they'll fail to even try to distinguish that, what that bias might be. Look, racism is considered by white Americans generally to be like the ultimate sin, right? Unforgivable. You can lose your job, your reputation, friends, your respect. And that's all just for being accused of being racist. So one should be very careful about jumping to that conclusion. And yet the word seems to get bandied about without any consideration of its effects. I honestly abhor the academic mumbo-jumbo that perpetuates the white racism in America myth. This guy literally went out and exclusively spoke with people who would reinforce his biases. What a piece of shit.
Martha works for a non-profit organization that helps clients and businesses overcome racial bias.
It would be great to hear what prompted you to come to this class.
Today, she's reviewing the progress made by 3 former students.
White males actually have a culture. They think white male is the culture, right? There's a story that says fish don't know they swim in water. right? So white males don't know they live in a white male-dominated culture. And that was the biggest awakening. And once you knew that, then you could understand that there was institutionalized racism.
Wow. This poor, sad man. It's amazing to watch somebody have been totally brainwashed like that. White male-dominated culture? How is that an awakening? White people established the country. The population has been predominantly white since its inception. How could a dominance of white culture in America be a surprise to you? All right, now maybe you are completely oblivious to obvious things, but don't pull the rest of us white people into your little cave of ignorance. That's all you, buddy. Also, living in a white-dominated culture is okay. There's lots of white cultures out there. It doesn't make them bad, all right? What does he mean? Okay, then he says, once you knew that, you could start to understand that there was institutionalized racism. This woman has really brainwashed this guy. I wish I were there and I could challenge the BS that she's conditioning this guy with, because this is scary.
You have a lot of white, working class, poor people who do not feel that they are privileged because of their race.
Thank you. Finally, a sensible guy. Please don't backslide on this. White privilege is total bunk. You tell him that.
So, as far as you're concerned, there is no such thing as white privilege. It doesn't exist?
No, there's white privilege. There's all kinds of privilege.
No, you folded. Dude, you gotta stand up to that crap. Look, there's all kinds of privilege. Yes, but not white privilege. You're a good guy, but that was disappointing.
The election of Barack Obama distorted the debate on discrimination. For many white people, he marked the end of America's conversation on race. For black people, his success actually marked the beginning. And these are some of those for whom the so-called race card has been played out. White, working-class males flocking to Donald Trump.
We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
Blatherskite. First of all, the election of Barack Obama didn't end any conversation on race. No one has ever said that. And what do you mean for black Americans it was the beginning? They hadn't been discussing race up until that point. I know it sounds cooler to contrast one extreme with another, but they're both absurd. You can't say stupid things like that in a documentary. I mean, obviously you can, but come on, have some journalistic integrity. Then the guy goes on to suggest that people were drawn to Trump because Obama was black and they were tired of people using the race card. Yeah, we are tired of people using the race card, but race had nothing, zero, to do with the election of Donald Trump. And how deceptive is that clip of Donald Trump saying that his voters were uneducated? He was sarcastically quoting leftist critics who constantly demean Trump voters, and he included this in a list of just about every kind of voter imaginable. It is astonishing to me how the producers of this documentary seem to remorselessly pull things out of context. I mean, honestly, I shouldn't be too surprised. I studied documentary theory in London, and I know how these people think. Total fabrication is considered entirely acceptable to these people. All right, leftists are seriously the worst.
Any discussion of white privilege must account for the problems of the poor and working class. But few would argue it's easier to be poor and white in America than poor and black.
What? Why is being poor and black harder than being poor and white? Being poor sucks for everybody. Explain how being poor and white is so awesome. Okay? You can't just say something like that and then skip over it like you didn't just say something completely insane. That is a huge assertion right there. It's a hugely significant thing to propose. I need some reason to believe it. This guy backs up nothing. He constantly makes insane assertions with zero evidence. It is infuriating.
There's a growing awareness of how corrosive white privilege can be. This video caused a storm online and was produced under the direction of Alice Hunt and her team. Put those on. Okay, so what do you see then?
I see confusion and disruption in my normal way of looking at the world. And that's what we intended to do with these classes. We wanted to encourage people to start thinking about what it might be like to be in someone else's shoes.
This is honestly so stupid I can't even comment on it. Let's just move on.
My journey into the mind of white America has been an eye-opener. I can now better understand how some people can blithely be unaware of the racism around them, be able to push it to one side, push the chaos to the backs of their minds. But is that an excuse for society not doing anything? No.
Wow. That was actually worse than I had predicted. This guy didn't even look for anything at all. He had a preconceived idea and just pretended to be investigating something, right? When in reality, he was just compiling quotes from white people that would back up his preconceived ideas about the world that he wanted to express to people. This is pure propaganda masquerading as journalism. Let me tell you why this thing pisses me off so much. I used to live in England, and I know that their perceptions about America are already limited and distorted. This report is just one of many such propaganda pieces about America that the typical Brit is exposed to regularly. Deceptive documentaries like this destroy the reputation of America abroad. And if you ever wondered why Europeans think so poorly of Americans, it's because of bullcrap hit pieces like this. If the BBC tried to actually do some real reporting, maybe they'd have discovered the real reason white people in America don't see white racism as a serious problem. They discover that white Americans aren't racist. Well, that's it for me. If you like this video, give me a like. If you want to see more like this, please subscribe and hit that bell. And if you hate me, you are probably a British documentary filmmaker.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.